It started 2 weeks ago. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the longer it went on, the clearer it became. She was watching me. She first appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a cup of tea and scrolling mindlessly on my phone when I glanced out the window. Across the street, partially hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and a long trench coat, she stood beneath an old oak tree. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight at my house. I told myself it was nothing, probably a neighbor or someone waiting for a ride. But she stayed. Long after the rain stopped and the streetlights flickered on, she remained rooted to that spot. The next day, I woke early to water the garden, and there she was again. Same hat, same coat, same unwavering stare. This time, she was sitting on the bench across the street, a paperback book in her hands. She didn't even pretend to read it. By the fourth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, if she'd noticed the woman. "Oh, that one?" Mrs. Jenkins said, peering through her thick glasses. "She's been around, but I figured she was new to the area. Seems harmless enough." Harmless wasn't the word I'd use. The way she watched my house. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was intent, purposeful. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? "Excuse me, there's a strange woman sitting across the street and she keeps staring at my house." They'd laugh me off the phone. That evening, I decided to confront her myself. Heart pounding, I stepped out of my house and crossed the street. As I approached, her gaze shifted to me. Her eyes were dark, piercing, and far too calm. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound firm. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then she spoke, her voice soft but carrying an edge that sent chills down my spine. "Not yet." "Not yet?" I repeated, confused. "Why are you watching my house?" She smiled faintly, an expression devoid of warmth. "I'm not watching the house. I'm watching you." That did it. I stepped back, my fight or flight instincts kicking in. "Look, I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Now." The woman said nothing more. She simply stood, turned, and walked down the street, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sent me bolting upright in bed. The next morning, I called the police and explained what had been happening. They promised to send someone to patrol the area, but admitted there wasn't much they could do without a direct threat. Days passed, and she didn't return. I started to think maybe she'd moved on. Maybe she'd found someone else to watch. But then, late one night, I heard a sound, like fingernails tapping against glass. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, sharper this time. Slowly, I turned toward the window. She was there. Her face was pressed against the glass, her dark eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp in my haste. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. Her voice came through, muffled but distinct. "It's time." "Time for what?" I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. By the time the police arrived, she was gone. The only evidence she'd been there was a faint, hand-shaped smudge on the window pane. I installed cameras around the house the next day, but she never came back. Not physically, at least. Now, I see her in my dreams. She stands at the edge of a dark forest, her hat and coat gone, her eyes burning with a strange light. She whispers my name over and over until I wake up drenched in sweat. I don't know what she wants or why she chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that she's waiting for something. Something I don't want to face. I tried to move on with my life. Days turned into weeks, and the strange woman seemed like a distant nightmare, one I could push into the far corners of my mind. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching. One night, I sat at my desk going through paperwork for my job. The soft hum of my desk lamp filled the silence. I had almost convinced myself that everything was back to normal, until the power went out. The room plunged into darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. As I did, I caught a reflection in the black screen of my laptop. She was standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just my empty room. My pulse thundered in my ears. This couldn't go on. I needed answers. The next morning, I began researching. I didn't know her name or where she came from, but I remembered the way her dark eyes gleamed and her cryptic words. It's time. I typed everything into online forums, paranormal blogs, and local history sites, hoping for a lead. It wasn't until the third day of searching that I found something. A post on an obscure forum about urban legends mentioned a figure called the Watcher. According to the post, the Watcher appeared to individuals at turning points in their lives, moments when something significant was about to change. The stories varied, but one detail was consistent. No one who saw the Watcher ever lived an ordinary life again. Some claimed she was a guardian. Others said she was a harbinger of doom. And a few, just a few, believed she was there to guide people to their destinies, whether they wanted to go or not. Destiny? Doom? The words swirled in my mind as I paced my living room. None of this made sense. I didn't feel special or destined for anything. My life was normal, boring even. But then I remembered. 2 weeks before she first appeared, I'd received an email from a company offering me a job in another state. It was a huge step up from my current position, but it meant leaving everything I knew behind. I hadn't responded yet, too scared to take the leap. Could this be why she was here? Was she waiting for me to decide? That night, I dreamed of her again. This time she was closer. I could see her face in detail, the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the faint scar running down her temple. She spoke in a voice that echoed through the dream. "You can't stay here," she said. I woke up with my heart racing. I didn't want to believe it, but something in me knew she was right. My current life felt safe, but it wasn't enough. I'd been hiding from the unknown, from change, for too long. The next morning, I accepted the job. The day I packed up my car to leave, I looked across the street one last time. The bench where she used to sit was empty, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. As I drove away from my house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was standing at the end of the street watching me. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others. Shadowy figures, barely distinguishable, lined the street in silence. They didn't move, didn't follow. They just watched. I don't know what lies ahead. But I do know one thing. My life is no longer ordinary. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what she wanted all along. Weeks passed, and I settled into my new life. The job was challenging, the city was bustling, and for a while I managed to convince myself that whatever happened back home, the woman, the figures, the ominous sense of being watched, was behind me. But the feeling never fully left. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to my small apartment. I dropped my bag, microwaved a quick dinner, and collapsed onto the couch. As I scrolled aimlessly through the TV channels, the screen froze. I frowned and reached for the remote, tapping buttons to no effect. The static grew louder, filling the room with its grating buzz. Then, just as I was about to turn the TV off, the screen changed. A face appeared. It was her. She wasn't wearing the trench coat or the wide-brimmed hat anymore. Her hair fell in dark, tangled waves around her face, and her eyes, those piercing dark eyes, stared directly into mine. "You moved," she said. Her voice was distorted, like it was coming from the depths of a cave. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "You think this is over?" she continued, her head tilting slightly. "It's only just begun." The screen went black. I sat there, paralyzed, until my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I jumped, my heart racing. Picking it up, I saw a text message from an unknown number. "Open the door." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to ignore it, but some part of me, maybe curiosity, maybe fear made me stand. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, except for an envelope on the floor. I picked it up cautiously, stepping back into the apartment and locking the door behind me. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and heavier than I expected. I tore it open and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. The map was crude, hand-drawn, but I recognized the area. It was a stretch of wilderness about an hour outside the city, a place I'd never been. At the bottom of the map was a single sentence, scrawled in a shaky hand. "You're not done yet." My mind raced. What did she want? Why this place? I told myself I wouldn't go. I wasn't going to let her, or whatever she was, control my life anymore. But the longer I stared at the map, the stronger the pull became. By the next morning, I was in my car, driving toward the location. The road grew narrow, the city disappearing behind me as trees closed in on both sides. When I finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dense forest. I parked the car and stepped out, clutching the map tightly. The trail led deep into the woods, the air growing colder with each step. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Then I saw her. She stood in a clearing, her back to me, silhouetted against the twilight. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I knew she was aware I was there. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, her face unreadable. "You chose this path," she said. "But you don't understand what you've stepped into." "What do you mean?" I demanded. She gestured to the ground at her feet. As I stepped closer, I saw it. A circle etched into the dirt, lined with symbols I couldn't understand. In the center of the circle was a small black box. "You opened the door," she said. "Now you must decide whether to close it." "What's in the box?" Her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Your next step. Your destiny." I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for the box. When my fingers touched the cold surface, a shock ran through me, and the forest around us seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, the trees distorted, and the ground beneath me felt unstable. "What's happening?" I shouted. "The choice is yours," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around us. "Take it and embrace what's to come. Leave it and return to the life you knew, though it will never be the same." I stared at the box, my mind racing. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing about this was normal. I took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside was a key. The woman's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps, or pity. "You've made your choice," she said. Before I could respond, the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I woke, I was back in my apartment, the map crumpled in my hand. The box was gone, but the key was on the table, and engraved on it was a single word: tomorrow. The key sat on my table, gleaming in the dim light of my apartment. I stared at it for what felt like hours, turning it over in my hands, running my fingers along the engraved word. Tomorrow. Tomorrow what? What was I supposed to do? There were no further instructions, no explanation, just this single, cryptic clue. The rest of the night was restless. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, her calm expression, her piercing gaze. The forest. The box. The symbols etched in the dirt. When the sun rose, I was still wide awake, sitting on the edge of my bed, the key clenched tightly in my palm. I didn't have to wait long to find out what tomorrow meant. At 9 a.m. sharp, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't the hesitant, polite knock of a delivery driver or a neighbor. It was deliberate, heavy, and unrelenting. I froze. Another knock. I forced myself to stand and walk to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. There was no one there. But on the ground, where I had first found the envelope, was another item. This time, it was a small black envelope with my name written in silver ink. I picked it up and tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was elegant, almost otherworldly. Your journey begins at the clock tower. Bring the key. The clock tower. I knew the one. It was an old, crumbling structure on the edge of the city, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. No one went there anymore. I considered ignoring the message, throwing the key and the note into the trash and pretending none of this was happening. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. I was too far in now, and some part of me needed to see this through. By midday, I was standing in front of the clock tower. The structure loomed over me, its broken clock face frozen at 3:17, its once proud bricks weathered and cracked. The wind whistled through the gaps in the stone, carrying with it a faint, almost melodic hum. I stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of decay lingered. My footsteps echoed as I walked across the stone floor, the key clutched tightly in my hand. At the center of the tower, directly beneath the broken clock face, was a pedestal. On it rested a locked chest, covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen in the forest. This was it. My fingers trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a smooth click. The chest opened, revealing its contents. A book. It was bound in worn, dark leather, its cover unmarked except for a single symbol embossed in gold, a symbol I recognized from the circle in the forest. I picked up the book and flipped it open. The pages were filled with names, dates, and descriptions. Hundreds, maybe thousands of entries, all written in the same elegant handwriting as the note. I flipped to the last page, and my breath caught in my throat. My name was there. Next to it was today's date. And beneath it, 2 words. Keep going. What is this? I whispered aloud. You're part of it now, a familiar voice said behind me. I spun around, and there she was. The woman. She stood in the shadows, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. Part of what? I demanded. The cycle, she said, stepping closer. This book contains the names of those who must choose. Every one of them stood where you are now, holding that key, opening that chest. And now it's your turn to guide the next. What does that mean? My voice rose, panic bubbling in my chest. I didn't ask for this. No one does, she said softly. But the moment I appeared to you, your path was set. You've made your choices, you've opened the door, and now the responsibility is yours. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. You mean, I become you? She nodded. In a way, you'll watch, you'll guide, you'll wait for the next one to take the key. It's the only way the cycle continues. No, I said, shaking my head. There has to be another way. There isn't, she said. But don't worry, you'll understand in time. Before I could respond, she stepped forward and pressed something into my hand. Another key, different from the first, heavier, with a new word engraved on it. Begin. I looked up to question her, but she was already gone. Now I sit here, the book and key before me, knowing that somewhere out there, someone else's name will soon appear on the last page. And when it does, I'll be waiting. The days after receiving the book were a blur. I kept it hidden under my bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night I'd find myself pulling it out, tracing the names, running my fingers over the embossed symbols, and trying to make sense of what it all meant. The key with "Begin" engraved on it felt heavier than it should have. It stayed in my pocket constantly, like a talisman I didn't want to touch but couldn't bring myself to leave behind. Weeks passed without incident. I started to believe that maybe I could ignore it all, that the book, the key, the strange woman, and the cryptic words would fade into a bad memory. But deep down, I knew better. One night, I couldn't sleep. Restless, I sat at my kitchen table, the book and the key in front of me, My eyes drifted to the last page, the one with my name, date, and the words, "Keep going." For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint, almost invisible lines stretching from my name to the blank space below. It looked like the book was waiting for the next name to be written. I slammed the book shut and stood up, pacing. "This isn't my job," I muttered. "I didn't sign up for this." As if in response, the lights flickered. I froze. A chill ran through the air, and the faint hum I'd heard in the clock tower returned, growing louder by the second. The book began to vibrate on the table, its cover glowing faintly with a golden light. And then, it opened itself. The pages flipped rapidly, faster than I could track, until they settled on a new page. Another name. I stared at it, my heart pounding. The name was unfamiliar, but the address written below it wasn't far from my apartment. I didn't have time to question how it got there. Something inside me, something primal and unavoidable, compelled me to move. I grabbed the key, shoved it in my pocket, and left. The address led me to a small, rundown house at the edge of the city. The windows were dark and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I hesitated at the gate, debating whether I should turn back. But then I saw her. A young woman stood in the window, staring out at me with wide, fearful eyes. She wasn't the woman who had watched my house for weeks. This woman was younger, vulnerable, and clearly terrified. She opened the door before I could knock. "You're here," she said, her voice trembling. "You were expecting me?" I asked, confused. "Not you exactly," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "But something's been happening. I keep hearing whispers, seeing things out of the corner of my eye. And then last night, I dreamed about a man holding a book and a key. I knew someone would come." I swallowed hard. "Listen, I don't know how to explain this, but you've been chosen." "For what? I'm still figuring out myself. But this key?" I pulled it from my pocket. "And this book, they're connected to something bigger than us." She stared at the key like it was something holy. "What am I supposed to do?" I shook my head. "I don't know. All I know is that you have to make a choice. You can take the key and open whatever door it leads to, or you can walk away. But if you choose to walk away, you'll never escape this feeling, this pull. It'll haunt you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I said softly. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the key. Then, with trembling hands, she reached out and took it. The moment her fingers closed around it, the air in the room shifted. A low hum vibrated through the walls, and the faint outlines of symbols, like the ones I'd seen in the forest and on the chest in the clock tower, glowed on the floor around us. Her eyes widened. "What's happening?" I stepped back as the light intensified, surrounding her in a golden glow. "You've taken the first step," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the light vanished. The woman stood there, the key still in her hand, her expression unreadable. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer, but the book in my hand did. It flipped to another page, and there, beneath her name, a new name began to appear. The cycle had begun again. And now I understood. I was no longer just a participant. I was part of the cycle. A guide, a watcher, a keeper of the key. As I left her house and walked into the night, I felt the weight of my new role settle over me. Somewhere out there, someone else was waiting, and I would be the one to find them. The cycle didn't end. It never would. That's the first truth I learned in the days that followed. Every time the book revealed a new name, I felt the same pull, the same weight pressing down on my chest. It didn't matter if I tried to ignore it. The hum would start, the lights would flicker, and the symbols on the book would glow until I gave in. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I was helping people, guiding them through some strange, cosmic puzzle I didn't fully understand. But as time went on, a darker truth began to creep in. Not everyone wanted to take the key. And for those who refused, the consequences were horrifying. One name, a man named Victor, lived in a decrepit apartment on the other side of town. When I knocked on his door, he answered with bloodshot eyes and the stench of alcohol hanging heavy in the air. "I don't want anything to do with this," he said the moment I showed him the key. "Take it and leave." "You don't understand," I said, trying to reason with him. "If you don't," I said, "leave," he shouted, slamming the door in my face. I stayed outside his apartment for hours, hoping he'd change his mind, but he never opened the door again. The next morning, his name disappeared from the book, and a week later, I read about his death in the newspaper. They found him in his apartment, his body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The article didn't describe the scene in detail, but the words, "unnatural circumstances," stuck with me. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. After that, I stopped trying to convince people. Either they took the key or they didn't. It wasn't my job to force them. But with each new name, the cycle grew stranger. One day, I found myself standing at the door of a 12-year-old boy. He answered with a cautious, curious expression, and when I handed him the key, he took it without hesitation. "I've been dreaming about this," he said, clutching the key tightly. "Thank you." I watched as the golden light surrounded him, the same symbols glowing on the ground, and I realized something chilling. The cycle didn't care about age, background, or circumstances. It chose people indiscriminately, pulling them into its web without explanation or mercy. But the most disturbing moment came a few months later. The book gave me a name I recognized: my sister. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since we'd had a falling out over something trivial. But when I saw her name in the book, my stomach dropped. I knew I had to face her, to explain everything, even if she didn't believe me. When I arrived at her house, she opened the door with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I need to talk to you," I said, holding up the book. She glanced at it, then back at me. "What is this?" "It's complicated," I said, stepping inside. "But you need to trust me. You've been chosen." She laughed bitterly. "Chosen for what? This some kind of cult thing?" "No, it's not like that," I said, placing the key on the table between us. "This key is connected to something bigger, something I don't fully understand. But if you don't take it—" "What happens if I don't?" she interrupted, her tone sharp. I hesitated, the image of Victor's contorted body flashing in my mind. "You don't want to know." She stared at the key, her expression unreadable. "Why me?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've seen what happens to people who refuse. Please just trust me on this." She picked up the key, turning it over in her hands. For a moment, I thought she was going to accept it. But then she placed it back on the table and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "Please, don't—" But she was already standing, motioning toward the door. "I think you should go." I left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, I sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. The next morning, her name disappeared from the book. I rushed to her house, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was too late. The police were already there, the house cordoned off with yellow tape. I didn't need to go inside to know what they'd find. I stood there, staring at the house as the weight of the cycle pressed down on me like never before. It wasn't just a responsibility. It was a curse. And now I'm left wondering, how long until my name appears in the book again? And when it does, will there be anyone left to guide me? After my sister's death, everything changed. The book seemed heavier now, its pages almost vibrating with anticipation, as if it were alive and feeding on the lives it claimed. I avoided looking at it, kept it shoved under the couch, but it didn't matter. I always knew when a new name appeared. The hum would start low, vibrating through my apartment, growing louder until I couldn't ignore it. But I was different now. I wasn't just reluctant, I was furious. The cycle wasn't some noble task or higher calling. It was cruel, senseless, and merciless. It didn't care about people. It didn't care about families, dreams, or futures. And worst of all, it had claimed someone I loved. I tried to destroy the book. I set it on fire, threw it in a dumpster, even buried it miles away in an abandoned field. But no matter what I did, I'd wake up the next morning to find it back on my coffee table, pristine and untouched. The cycle wouldn't let me go. But if it wasn't going to release me, I decided I'd fight back. The next time a name appeared in the book, I didn't go. The hum grew louder than ever, shaking my apartment, rattling the windows, but I didn't care. I turned up the music, drowning out the sound, and refused to acknowledge the name. For days, nothing happened. I thought I'd won. And then they started coming. It began with shadows, faint shapes in the corners of my vision, flickering just out of reach. Then came the whispers, soft and insistent, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But the worst was the knocking. It started one night at 3:17 a.m., the same time frozen on the clock tower. A single knock at the door, loud and deliberate. I didn't answer. The next night, it came again. This time, it didn't stop. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. When I finally opened it, there was no one there. The third night, I didn't even bother getting up. But when the knocking stopped, I turned to find someone standing in my bedroom. It wasn't the woman who had watched my house, nor was it anyone I recognized. It was a man, tall and thin, his face pale and hollow. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and his mouth twisted into a smile that sent chills down my spine. "You're breaking the rules," he said, his voice low and cold. "I don't care," I snapped, standing my ground. "I didn't ask for this, and I'm not playing your game anymore." His smile widened. "You think you're free to choose?" He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "The cycle doesn't care about your defiance. It only cares that you comply. Refuse, and you'll become part of the debt owed to it." "What debt?" I demanded. "You're not the first to resist," he said, his voice almost amused. "But you won't succeed where they failed. The cycle demands balance, and when you deny it, something or someone must pay the price." I thought of Victor, of my sister, of the countless names in the book, each one a thread in this monstrous web. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I'm done." The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "So be it." The next day, the book showed me. When I opened it, I expected a new name, but instead it was filled with images. Pictures of people I knew, friends, coworkers, neighbors. My sister's name was there again, her face staring back at me, frozen in fear. And beneath each name was a date. They were all tomorrow. The cycle wasn't just coming for me anymore. It was coming for everyone around me. I spent the day in a haze of panic and desperation, trying to warn people, to keep them safe, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. That night, the knocking returned. When I opened the door, the man was there again, holding the book in one hand and the key in the other. "It's time," he said, his smile colder than ever. I realized then what the cycle had been trying to teach me all along. There was no escape, no refusal, no defiance. Only the choice. Take the key or watch everything you love be consumed. With trembling hands, I took the key. The man stepped aside, and the hallway beyond my door stretched into darkness, a path lined with glowing symbols that pulsed with an eerie golden light. "Where does it lead?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile didn't waver. "You'll see." And so, with the key in my hand and the book under my arm, I stepped into the darkness, knowing that whatever lay ahead, I would never be the same. the cycle had claimed me completely. And somewhere, far behind me, another name was already being written.